You are trying to make a man live forever. It is around the year 850. You are in a workshop in the hills of Tang China, shutters open, because the air in here is already bad. In front of you are stone bowls, a small furnace, and a set of minerals that men you respect have told you will unlock something enormous. Your customer is wealthy, possibly royal. He does not want a longer life. He wants no death at all. And you are not a crank. You are a professional. You have training, texts, teachers, a lineage. In the year 850, this is a respectable career with imperial funding. Think of it as the world's first longevity industry. No cold plunges, no supplement subscription arriving in a nice matte box, no man on a podcast telling you his biological age is 26. Just minerals, heat, and total conviction that the body is a machine, and machines can be fixed if you find the right parts. This morning, the machine fixes nothing. There is a flash. There is a sound this room has never made before. Heat comes off the bowl in one shove and puts you on the floor, and your hands hurt in a way you will remember for whatever is left of a life you have just made shorter. The roof is burning. The building will not last the hour. You did not invent a weapon. You were not trying to. You were trying to cure death, and you cracked open the door to the most efficient killing technology our species has ever built. Here is the part that gets skipped. Almost every version of this story you have heard compresses it into one line. The Chinese invented gunpowder, and then there were guns. That is not what happened, and the real sequence is far stranger. Because after that first accident, it took roughly 400 years, 4 centuries of burned faces, split tubes, and failed paper shells, before anybody built a thing that killed by bursting instead of by burning. 400 years. That is longer than the gap between the first flight at Kitty Hawk and today, twice over, with room to spare. For most of that time, the world had this substance and could not turn it into a bomb. Not because they lacked the recipe, they had it written down. They lacked the container. That is the real story, not the fire, the box you put it in. So let's go back to the workshop and start with a question almost nobody asks. What on earth were these people actually doing? They were doing medicine. Real medicine, by the standards of their own world. Chinese alchemy of this period had a goal, and the goal was not gold. It was the elixir, a prepared substance that would stabilize the body, halt decay, and let a person keep going indefinitely. Emperors funded it, not as a hobby, as policy. And it worked about as well as you would expect. The Old Book of Tang and the New Book of Tang, the official dynastic histories, record something that reads today like a very slow horror story. Emperor Xianzong dies in the year 820, after taking elixirs prepared for him. Emperor Wuzong dies in 846. The same way. These are not peasants misreading a folk remedy. These are the most protected men in the largest empire on earth, dying from the treatment. Sit with that for a second. The Immortality Project had a body count before the weapons did. Which tells you what kind of laboratory culture this was. Ambitious, well-funded, willing to test on the powerful, and constantly heating unstable things in enclosed spaces to see what happened. Something was going to catch fire eventually. So what did they say when it did? They wrote a warning, and it survives. There is a Taoist text, usually dated to the middle of the 9th century, the Zhenyuan Miao Dao Yao Lue, preserved in the great Taoist canon. Buried inside it is a note to fellow practitioners, and it is not triumphant. It is exasperated. It says, in effect, some of you have combined these particular things, and it has set your hands and faces on fire, and it has burned down the buildings you were working in. Do not do this. That is the earliest clear written trace we have. Not a battle report, not a general's memo, a safety notice, from one chemist to another, telling colleagues to please stop maiming themselves. The historian of Chinese science, Joseph Needham, who spent decades reconstructing this material in his enormous Science and Civilization in China, made a point about the naming that I think about constantly. The word that emerges for this substance is huoyao. It means literally fire medicine, fire drug, not fire powder, not war powder, medicine. The word enters the language from the pharmacy shelf, and it never fully leaves. We will come back to that at the end, and it is going to land harder than you expect. But right now you have a substance, you have a name for it, and you have a workshop full of people who know it can hurt you. So how long until someone points it at another human being? Not long. That part is quick. Humans are reliable about this. The slow part is what the weapon looks like at first, and this is where almost everyone's mental image is wrong. For its first 3 centuries, this was not a bomb, it was a burning weapon. A flamethrower, essentially, and a fairly poor one. Around the middle of the 10th century, there is a painted silk banner from Dunhuang, from the Mogao caves in the far west of China, that Needham read as showing exactly this, a figure holding a tube with flame coming out of the end. The dating and the reading are debated. I will be honest with you about that, some scholars are not convinced. But the object it appears to show is well attested elsewhere. It is the fire lance, a spear with a tube strapped to the front. You light it, it throws a jet of flame and sparks a few feet forward for a few seconds, and then it is a spear again. Picture actually holding that. You are gripping a wooden shaft with a burning tube tied near your hands, in a crowd of people, during a siege. The weapon has one setting. It cannot be aimed with any real precision. It lasts about as long as a match. And it was still worth it, because at close quarters, in a breach, against men in padded armor, with wooden shields, an unexpected face full of fire is decisive. Not because of casualties, because of panic. Here is the counterintuitive bit, and it is the hinge of this whole story. In these years, an explosion was not the goal. An explosion was a malfunction. If your tube burst, your equipment had failed, and probably taken your hand with it. Nobody was chasing the bang. They were chasing a longer, hotter, more controllable jet of flame. The bomb was, for 300 years, the thing everyone was trying to avoid. So, who worked out that the failure was the weapon? To get there, someone first had to write all this down properly. And in the year 1044, someone did. It is called the Wujing Zongyao, the complete essentials for the military classics. It was compiled by Zheng Gongliang and Ding Du, and presented to the Song court, and it is the oldest surviving military manual in the world that includes this technology in detail, not a passing mention. Instructions, with diagrams, for incendiary devices and fire weapons, including something the text calls a thunderclap fireball. I am not going to walk you through any of the technical content, and no responsible account should, but the fact of the book matters enormously, for a reason that has nothing to do with chemistry. It means the knowledge left the workshop. Up to this point, this stuff lives with a scattered guild of specialists, half of whom are keeping secrets on purpose. After 1044, it lives in a state document, in a court library, in the standard reference literature of an empire's officer class. It becomes institutional. It becomes something a bureaucracy can improve, budget for, and mass produce. And a bureaucracy is exactly what you need. Because the problem was never knowledge, the problem was containment. Think about what you are actually asking for when you ask for a bomb. You need a shell strong enough to hold a very fast fire long enough for pressure to build to the point where the shell fails. And then you need it to fail all at once, everywhere, throwing its own body outward as the thing that does the damage. Too weak, and it splits early and just burns. Too strong, and it might not go at all. You are engineering a container whose only job is to be excellent right up until the instant it is destroyed. Paper cannot do that. Bamboo cannot really do it. Leather? No. For 3 centuries, the casings were made from what was cheap and available. And what was cheap and available leaked, tore, or burned through. So the question the 11th and 12th centuries hand forward is oddly specific. Not what should we put in it, what should it be made of? The answer arrives, as answers often do, because people were losing badly. By the 12th century, the Song dynasty is in serious trouble in the north. And under that pressure, you can watch the weapons change, decade by decade, in the records of specific sieges and specific battles. In 1132, a Song commander named Chen Gui defends the city of Da'an, in what is now Hubei, and his defense is recorded in a document called the Shoucheng Lu, the Da'an defense record. Chen Gui's men use fire lances on the walls. This is one of the clearest early accounts we have of the weapon in real use, in a real siege, by a named officer, on a known date, in a known place. Then in 1161, on the Yangtze, at the Battle of Keishi, the Song official Yu Yunwen faces a Jin fleet with a badly outmatched force. The history of song describes projectiles launched at the enemy ships that make a thunderclap sound and produce smoke and fire on the water. Yu Yunwen was, by background, a civil administrator. He was not a career soldier. He won anyway. Now look at what changed between those two dates. In 1132, the weapon is in your hands, and it works at arm's length. By 1161, it is leaving the ship, traveling through the air, and arriving somewhere else. Someone has to catch it. Someone across the water is now dealing with your fire. That is the whole conceptual leap of the bomb, happening in slow motion over 30 years, on a river, in a war most people watching this have never heard of. But those projectiles still mostly burned. They frightened, they smoked, they set fires. They did not yet do the specific thing a modern bomb does. So when does that happen? When does the container finally get good enough? We can very nearly put a date on it, the year 1232, at the siege of Kaifeng. The Mongols are besieging the city. The defenders are the Jin, who, a century earlier, were the ones doing the besieging, which is its own quiet lesson about how long anybody stays on top. And the Jin have something new. The history of Jin, the Jin Shi, calls it the Zhentian Lei, heaven-shaking thunder. The name is doing a lot of work. It is not called fire something. Nobody named it after burning. They named it after the noise. The account describes a device in a cast iron casing. It describes the sound being heard at great distance. And it describes the effect that changes everything. When it burst, the casing itself came apart into fragments that could punch through iron armor. Read that again. The killing was not being done by the fire. It was being done by the container. That is the invention. That is the moment the bomb exists as a category. A weapon whose lethality comes from the violent disassembly of its own body. Everything since, all of it, is a refinement of what happened on those walls. Let's reconstruct 1 minute of it, because the sources let us get quite close. You are on the wall at Kaifeng. It is cold. You have been under siege long enough that hunger is not an event anymore. It is just the weather. Below you, at the base of the wall, Mongol sappers are working under cover, digging, protected from your arrows by shields and hides. You cannot reach them by shooting down. Everybody has tried. So you and another man lower one of these things on an iron chain. Slowly, hand over hand. It is heavy, it is lit, and it is going down toward men who cannot see it coming, and every part of you understands the timing question in a way that requires no explanation. Then the wall shakes, and the noise arrives, and the digging stops. Take a breath, because that soldier is doing something no human being had ever done before in the history of the species, and he almost certainly did not know that. He thought he was solving a problem with the sappers. That is how it usually goes. Nobody in the room ever knows they are in the room. And now the part of Kaifeng that almost never gets told, because it ruins the shape of the story. It did not work. The Jin had the first true bomb in human history, and they lost. The siege ground on, disease and starvation did what siege warfare always does, and the city fell to the Mongols the following year. The dynasty was finished within months. The most advanced weapon on the planet, deployed by the people who built it, from behind their own walls, against an enemy who had never seen anything like it, and it did not save them. It did something else instead. It taught the Mongols. That is the pattern for the next 800 years, and you already know it, because you have watched it happen in your own lifetime with other technologies. A decisive advantage is decisive exactly once. Then it is everybody's. The Mongol Empire was the fastest information network the world had ever had, and what it moved best was not silk or silver. It was know-how. So the bomb did not win a war. It escaped one. And here is where this stops being a story about weapons at all, and becomes a story about power, which is where the historian Charles Tilly comes in, and where this whole topic reframes itself. Tilly is the political sociologist behind the line that war made the state, and the state made war. His argument, developed in coercion, capital, and European states, is that the modern government, the tax office, the census, the standing army, the public debt, is largely a machine that grew up around the problem of paying for organized violence. The historian Jeffrey Parker, in The Military Revolution, supplies the hardware half of the same story. Once cannon can knock down a medieval wall, defensive architecture has to be completely reinvented, and the new fortifications are staggeringly expensive. Put those together and something clicks into place. A castle is a one-time purchase. A gunpowder war is a subscription. You need foundries. You need continuous supply. You need engineers who can calculate, and clerks who can count what the engineers used, and officials who can extract enough tax from farmers 3 provinces away to keep it all running, every year, forever. A local lord with a strong tower and loyal men cannot do that. A state with paperwork can. So the bomb quietly rewrites the rules of who is allowed to rule. Not by winning one battle, by making war so expensive that only large, bureaucratic, tax-hungry organizations can afford to fight, and everything smaller gets absorbed, or flattened, or made irrelevant. Here is my honest take on it, and you can disagree in the comments. The gun is not the important invention in this story. The gun is a container with a longer neck. The important invention was the idea that a thing could be built specifically to destroy itself, on command, and that the destruction was the point. Once you have that concept, everything downstream is engineering. And the concept traveled fast. Because empires move things, and the 13th century has the largest land empire in history moving everything. Within a few decades of Kaifeng, the knowledge is in the Islamic world, and shortly after that it is in Europe. In England, around the year 1267, the friar Roger Bacon writes about the substance in his Opus Majus, and in a letter usually known as the Epistola. And he does something wonderfully human with it. He describes what it can do, and then deliberately conceals part of what he knows inside a scrambled phrase. The medieval version of a password you cannot recover. Scholars have argued about that passage for centuries. You will also sometimes hear that the real inventor was a German monk called Berthold Schwarz. Please do not repeat that one. There is no reliable contemporary evidence he existed. He is a legend that grew up later, most likely because Europe wanted a European origin story for something it had received rather than created. Meanwhile, the hardware kept getting harder. There is a small bronze hand cannon, called the Xanadu gun, recovered from the ruins of Shangdu in Inner Mongolia, carrying an inscription that dates it to the year 1298. It is the oldest firearm we have, with a confirmed date written on the object itself. A comparable piece from Heilongjiang is dated to around 1288, and scholars argue about which came first. Look at the span. Around 850, a man burns his hands making a health product. By 1298, 450 years later, someone is casting a bronze tube to fire a projectile, and it is a manufactured item with a date stamped on it. And now here is the detail that has stayed with me longer than anything else in this research. In the year 1596, in Ming, China, the physician Li Shizhen publishes the Bencao Gongmu, the most important pharmaceutical work in Chinese history. Thousands of entries, decades of labor, and in it, he lists this substance. As a medicine, for treating skin parasites, for killing insects. 5.5 centuries after it appeared in a military manual, 3.5 centuries after Kaifeng, it is still sitting in the pharmacy section, still carrying its old name, fire medicine, as if nothing had happened. I do not think that is ignorance. I think it is the most honest thing in this entire story. The category never got corrected, because the people who named it were not wrong about what they were doing. They were making medicine. The world just did something else with it. Which brings us to the part I find genuinely difficult. Go back to that first workshop. Around the year 850, a man with burned hands sits down and writes a warning. Not to protect the public, he has no concept of that, but to protect his colleagues. Do not combine these things. It burns you. It burns your house. He is trying to make people live longer, and even in his failure, he is trying to keep people from getting hurt. Now move forward 1100 years. 5:29 in the morning, the 16th of July 1945, in the desert at Alamogordo, New Mexico. J. Robert Oppenheimer and his team watched the Trinity test, and Oppenheimer later reaches for a line from the Bhagavad Gita to describe what he saw. Many of the men who built it spent the rest of their lives writing warnings about it. 2 men, 11 centuries between them, both of them at the absolute frontier of what their civilization understood about matter. Both convinced they were doing something constructive. Both left a written warning behind. Neither warning worked. Not one of them. That is not a story about Chinese alchemy or about physics. That is a story about us. We have never once, in recorded history, developed the ability to release a large amount of energy quickly and then decided not to point it at each other. Not once. The pattern is perfect, and it is perfect because the same qualities are involved in both halves. The curiosity that makes you heat the unknown thing, and the fear that makes you want the biggest one first. The alchemist and the physicist are not opposites. They are the same person, separated by better instruments. And now the honest part. We do not know who did it first. There is no name. The man in that 9th century workshop is anonymous, and always will be. We do not know whether the accident happened once or 100 times in 100 separate workshops over decades before anyone thought it was worth writing down. The Dunhuang banner is debated. The exact chain from Kaifeng to Europe is reconstructed, not documented. Whole centuries of this are inference built on a handful of surviving texts, most of which survived by luck. But here is what we do know, and it is enough. We know it started as medicine, because the word says so, and the word never changed. We know it took roughly 400 years to become a bomb, and that the delay was a problem of containers, not of knowledge. We know that in 1232, on the walls of Kaifeng, something burst and killed with its own fragments, and that every bomb since is a descendant of that. And we know that the people who found it were not trying to kill anyone, they were trying to stop people dying, which is the part I cannot get past. The oldest explosive on Earth is named after healing. It came out of a project whose entire purpose was to defeat death, and it went on to become the most efficient method of causing death our species has ever produced, while keeping its original name, sitting quietly in a medical encyclopedia, for another 700 years. Somewhere in a mountain workshop, a man is grinding minerals to make his customer immortal. He fails. His customer dies. He dies. Every emperor who funded this work dies, most of them faster because of it. The fire medicine outlived them all. So here is my question for you, and I want a real answer in the comments, because I have gone back and forth on this for weeks. If that alchemist could have seen the whole line, the wall at Kaifeng, the guns, the desert in New Mexico, all of it running downstream from his burned hands, should he have written the warning at all, or should he have burned the notes and said nothing? Tell me, I read them. And the next time you hear that a new discovery is going to save us, remember what the word gunpowder used to mean. It meant fire medicine. It was supposed to help.